A hotel manager, driven by prejudice, orders a cleaner to become invisible for a meeting with a foreign billionaire. What he doesn't know is that the man he dismissed as just a cleaner holds the exact key to saving the biggest business deal in the hotel's history. This is a powerful story of underestimated talent, quiet dignity, and how a moment of arrogance can be met with an unexpected and unforgettable display of competence. "You need to get that black guy out of here now," whispered manager David Mendez into his walkie-talkie, his eyes fixed on the Chinese businessman crossing the lobby of the Grand Palace Hotel. "I can't have people like that walking around during this meeting." His voice trembled with nervousness as he adjusted his tie for the 5th time in 2 minutes. Mr. Chen, a real estate billionaire who controlled more than 50 properties in Asia, walked toward the elevators with his entourage of 6 impeccably dressed executives. David had spent 3 weeks preparing for this meeting. The investment of 300 million reais was practically guaranteed, according to his boss. All he had to do was not screw it up. "Mr. Chen, welcome to the Grand Palace." David extended his hand with the warmest smile he could muster. "It is an honor to have you at our hotel." Chen nodded politely, but immediately turned to his associates and began speaking rapidly in Mandarin. The tone was clearly questioning, perhaps even concerned. David's smile froze. Pure panic flooded his nervous system. He desperately pulled out his cell phone, opening Google Translate with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen," David stammered. "Could you repeat that in English?" Chen frowned and repeated something in Mandarin, gesturing toward the hotel facilities. His expression showed growing irritation. David typed frantically into the app, but the translation that appeared was, "Hot fish problem, dirty water business, not good." The response was so absurd that one of the Chinese executives stifled a laugh. I'm sorry," David stammered, sweat dripping from his forehead. "Our official translators will be here in an hour." Chen shook his head, clearly disappointed, and said something that sounded definitive to his companions. "You didn't need to understand Mandarin to realize that the meeting was going down the drain." In the corner of the lobby, almost invisible pushing a cleaning cart, Janitor Mateo Santos watched the whole scene unfold. At 34, he had grown accustomed to being treated like part of the furniture. For years working there, and David had never even looked in his direction for more than 2 seconds. What no one there knew was that Mateo understood every word Chen was saying. And what the Chinese businessman was really questioning was not the hotel facilities. He was asking if the manager was sure about the legal aspects of the investment, considering the new regulations for foreign capital in Brazil. Mateo held the broom tightly, watching David fall into despair as Chen began to show signs that he was considering ending the meeting. For a moment, his eyes met those of the Chinese businessman. Chen noticed something different in that look, an intelligence that contrasted strangely with a simple uniform and hierarchical position. There, amid the chaos of incompetence and prejudice disguised as professionalism, Mateo maintained a calm that only exists in those who have been through much worse situations and learn that patience has its right moment to turn into action. 3 hours before that disaster, David had gathered the entire cleaning team in the basement of the hotel. "I want all of you to be invisible today," he declared, pacing back and forth like a general before battle. "The customer who arrives is worth more than all of your annual salaries combined." His eyes stopped on Mateo, who was methodically cleaning a window at the back of the room. "Especially you, Mateo. No wandering around the social areas. Understood?" Mateo just nodded, accustomed to this type of comment. David always spoke to him as if he were deaf or mentally challenged. "That Chinese guy can't see you working. People like him are used to different standards," David continued, completely ignoring the fact that Mateo was Brazilian, just like him. What David didn't know was that Mateo Santos wasn't just a janitor who was lucky to work at a 5-star hotel. With a degree in business administration from a federal university, specializing in international business, he had spent 2 years studying Mandarin when he dreamed of working in foreign trade. After sending out 143 resumes and going to dozens of interviews where he was always the runner-up, Mateo learned a bitter lesson. In Brazil, his degree was worth less than the color of his skin. The job at the Grand Palace had literally been his last option before he ran out of money to pay the rent. As David continued his disrespectful comments, Matteo remembered the conversation he had had with his father last Sunday. "Son, you are 41 years old and you are still sweeping floors. This is not what I expected when I sacrificed so much to pay for your education." The pain in those words had cut deeper than any professional humiliation. His father, a retired bricklayer, had worked double shifts for 6 years to pay for his only son's college education. All the extra nights studying, all the family sacrifices, everything seemed to have been in vain. But today, something different was stirring in Matteo's chest as he watched panic take over the manager. Chen wasn't just questioning basic aspects of the hotel. His questions were about international tax compliance, foreign investment regulations, and legal structures for corporate holding companies in Brazil. Questions that Matteo could answer by heart, thanks to 2 years working as an intern at an international consulting firm before discovering that a black expert intern would never become a permanent consultant. "Mr. Chen, please, just a few minutes," David begged in the lobby. As the Chinese businessman grew increasingly irritated, Chen responded with a long, complex sentence in Mandarin, gesturing toward the documents in his hand. David typed desperately into the translator, but the response was, "Paper number confusing hotel. Not good business. Maybe that doesn't make any sense." David exploded, his professional composure finally giving way. Matteo, who was still pushing the cart through the lobby, understood perfectly what Chen had said. The documents presented contained contradictory information about the corporate structure. How can I trust a partner who can't even explain his own business properly? The Chinese businessman checked his watch again and said something to his associates. Matteo immediately recognized the tone. Chen was communicating that they would give them 10 more minutes before considering the meeting over. David continued typing frantically on his phone, sweat dripping onto the screen. "Mr. Chen, I'm sure we can work this out." Chen shook his head, clearly losing patience, and made a comment that Matteo knew would be devastating. This level of unpreparedness is unacceptable for an investment of this magnitude. Perhaps we should explore other options. It was at that moment that Matteo made a decision that would change his life forever. For years of daily humiliation. For years of being treated like furniture. For years of seeing his intelligence wasted while less qualified people occupied positions he could have performed with excellence. He stopped the cart, took off his rubber gloves, and walked toward the group. Each step was a silent declaration that the invisibility imposed on him was coming to an end. David, still focused on the phone, did not notice him approaching. Chen, however, watched with growing curiosity as this man in uniform walked directly toward them with a posture that contrasted completely with the submission everyone expected to see. What none of them knew was that Matteo had spent the last few months secretly studying Chen's company profile, preparing for a moment that even he didn't know would come, a moment where 4 years of patience and silent observation would become the key to rewriting not only the fate of that meeting, but the entire course of his own life. While David continued his desperate struggle with technology that couldn't properly translate a complex business conversation, Matteo positioned himself a few meters away from the group. Chen noticed something different in that employee's eyes, an intelligence and determination that definitely didn't match the hierarchical position his uniform suggested. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. On one side, a manager in a panic trying to save his career with inadequate tools. On the other, a billionaire businessman rapidly losing patience with what he considered unacceptable professional incompetence. And in the center, a man who had been underestimated for so long that everyone forgot to ask him what he was actually good at. What happened in the next few seconds proved that sometimes justice does not come from courts or laws, but from one person's courage to decide that they will no longer be invisible, especially when they possess exactly the tools that everyone else desperately needs, but never bothered to discover. Matteo took a deep breath and walked directly toward the panicked group. Each step was calculated, each movement a silent declaration that 4 years of humiliation were coming to an end. "Excuse me," he said quietly, but firmly enough to interrupt David's collective despair. David looked up from his cell phone, irritated. "Matteo, this is no time for cleaning. Get out of here immediately. Actually, Matteo continued, completely ignoring the order, I can help with the translation. An awkward silence filled the lobby. David blinked several times, as if he hadn't understood the words. Chen watched the scene with growing curiosity. You what? David stammered. Matteo, you're a janitor. Get back to your work. Matteo stood up straight and addressed Chen directly in fluent Mandarin. Mr. Chen, I apologize for the confusion. I can clarify your questions about the legal aspects of the investment you mentioned. Chen's eyes widened, clearly surprised. He quickly replied in Mandarin, testing Matteo's fluency. Do you understand the tax regulations for foreign investment in the Brazilian hotel sector? Perfectly, Matteo replied without hesitation. The changes implemented last year actually favor international investors like you, especially considering the holding structure your company uses. David watched the conversation, open-mouthed, understanding absolutely nothing, but sensing from Chen's expression that something extraordinary was happening. Who is this man? Chen asked in English, looking at David. He takes care of the cleaning, David muttered, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. Chen frowned. A cleaning employee who speaks fluent business Mandarin and understands international law. That's unusual. Matteo smiled discreetly. For 4 years, he had observed dozens of business meetings in the lobby, always invisible, always underestimated. He had seen David commit basic international protocol errors, witnessed misunderstandings that cost minor contracts, and witnessed arrogance that was now finally meeting its consequence. Mr. Chen, Matteo continued in Mandarin, your concerns about the documentation are valid. I can explain in detail how the proposed legal structure aligns with both Brazilian and Chinese regulations. Chen nodded, clearly impressed. Continue. Matteo began a detailed technical explanation of international tax compliance, citing specific codes and making precise comparisons with similar regulations in Singapore and Hong Kong. His speech was fluid and professional, demonstrating not only mastery of the language, but also a deep knowledge of international business. David stood frozen, watching an employee he had treated like furniture for 4 years suddenly conduct a highly specialized conversation with a Chinese billionaire. This is impossible, David muttered to himself. Chen, on the other hand, was visibly excited. He asked several complex questions about tax structures, special economic zones, and bilateral investment agreements. Matteo answered them all with surgical precision. Where did you study? Chen asked in Mandarin. Federal University, majoring in international business, with 2 years of complementary studies in Mandarin, Matteo replied. I also worked as a foreign trade consultant before other circumstances brought me here. Chen shook his head, clearly confused by the situation. A man with your qualifications working as a janitor? Matteo shrugged elegantly. Sometimes the job market has its own logic, especially for people like me. The phrase was spoken with such dignity that Chen immediately understood the unspoken implications. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at David. Sir? Chen asked, waiting for Matteo's last name. Santos. Matteo Santos. Mr. Santos, Chen said, I would very much like to continue our conversation in a more appropriate setting, perhaps in the conference room. David finally regained his voice. Wait, Matteo, you can't just. I need to understand what's going on here. Matteo turned to David with a calmness that bordered on frightening. What's happening, David? Is that your chances of losing this 300 million investment have just turned into an opportunity to really impress Mr. Chen? The question is, are you going to allow me to help save your meeting, or are you going to continue treating qualified employees as if they were invisible? The irony of the situation was delicious. David, who had spent years completely ignoring Matteo, now depended desperately on skills he had never bothered to discover existed. Matteo, when did you learn Mandarin? David asked, his voice trembling. It was on my resume when I was hired 4 years ago, Matteo replied simply. Page 2, Additional Qualifications section. David turned pale. He had never read Mateo's entire resume. Why bother learning the qualifications of a janitor? Chen watched the dynamic between the two men with growing interest. As an experienced businessman, he recognized when he was witnessing a dramatic shift in power. "Mr. Santos," Chen said in English, making sure David understood. "I am very impressed with your knowledge. I would like to invite you to officially participate in this meeting as a technical consultant." David swallowed hard. His job, his reputation, his entire career now depended on a man he had systematically humiliated and ignored for years. "Of course," David said, forcing a smile that fooled no one. "Mateo is a valuable part of our team." Mateo bowed his head politely. "It will be my pleasure to assist with the meeting, Mr. Chen. I'm sure we can answer all of your questions." As the group made its way to the conference room, Mateo felt something he hadn't felt in years, the weight of being truly seen. Not as a janitor who was supposed to be invisible, but as the skilled professional he had always been. David walked behind, cold sweat running down his back, realizing that his arrogant ignorance had almost cost the hotel the biggest deal in its history. Worse still, he now depended completely on the goodwill of a man he had treated like trash. Chen, meanwhile, made mental notes about human resource management. How could a luxury hotel have a talent like Mateo Santos cleaning bathrooms for 4 years? What other skills were being wasted through sheer administrative negligence? In the meeting room, Mateo took his place at the table with the confidence of someone who was finally where he should always have been. For years of quiet preparation, for years of watching and learning, for years of waiting for the right moment, and that moment had arrived. What Chen didn't know was that Mateo had spent the last few months secretly studying the complete profile of Chen International, including its previous investments, market strategies, and contractual preferences. He was not only fluent in Mandarin, he was completely prepared to conduct one of the most important negotiations of any consultant's career. David, sitting at the head of the table where he had always felt powerful, now watched nervously as Mateo opened a notebook he had discreetly retrieved from his cabinet, a notebook containing years of market analysis, case studies, and professional preparation that David had never suspected existed. For a moment, as Mateo adjusted his reading glasses and prepared for the most important presentation of his life, everyone in the room realized they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple business meeting. They were witnessing the moment when genuine talent finally found its stage after years of being forced to remain in the shadows by prejudice and ignorance. And that stage was about to reveal a performance that no one would ever forget. In the meeting room, Mateo opened his personal laptop and the first thing that appeared on the screen made Chen lean forward with genuine interest. It was a completely detailed presentation about Chen International, its investments in Latin America, market analyses, and growth projections for the Brazilian hotel sector. "Mr. Chen," Mateo began in fluent Mandarin, "I have prepared some data that I believe is relevant to your investment considerations." David watched in awe as Mateo navigated through sophisticated charts, detailed financial reports, and comparative analyses that had clearly required months of specialized research. When did you prepare this?" David stammered. "Over the last 8 months, Mateo replied calmly. "During my lunch breaks and weekends, I always thought it would be useful to better understand the market I work in." Chen asked a technical question about environmental regulations for new hotel developments. Mateo responded by citing specific codes, approval timelines, and even provided a detailed comparison with similar processes in Shanghai and Beijing. "Impressive," Chen murmured, clearly engaged. "His data on urban zoning is more up-to-date than our own legal departments." David tried to regain control of the meeting. "Mateo, that's very interesting, but perhaps we should focus on our official presentation." "Actually," Chen interrupted politely, "I'd rather continue listening to Mr. Santos. His analysis is exceptionally accurate." David's embarrassment was palpable. Here was an employee he had treated like a piece of furniture for 4 years, conducting the most important meeting in the hotel's history with a competence he himself had never demonstrated. Mateo then did something that surprised everyone. He addressed David directly in Portuguese. "May I suggest that you focus on the operational aspects of the hotel while I address the technical and regulatory issues with Mr. Chen?" The sentence was delivered with such professionalism that it sounded like collaboration, but everyone in the room understood the real dynamic. Matteo was graciously taking charge of a situation that David had completely lost. "Of course," David muttered, his authority evaporating before his very eyes. Chen made a remark in Mandarin about the exceptional quality of Matteo's analysis, commenting that he rarely encountered Brazilian consultants with such a depth of knowledge about Asian markets. "You are very kind," Matteo replied modestly. "I have always believed that understanding different cultural perspectives is essential for truly global business." It was then that Chen asked the question that would change everything. "Mr. Santos, may I ask what exactly is your current position at this hotel?" Matteo maintained his composure, but his gaze briefly met David's before he replied. "Officially, I've been working on the cleaning staff for 4 years." The silence that followed was deafening. Chen blinked several times, processing the information. "A man with your qualifications, cleaning rooms?" "It's a long story," Matteo said diplomatically. Chen turned to David, his expression changing noticeably. "Mr. David, I must say I'm perplexed. How does an organization lose talent of this caliber for 4 years?" David swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Well, sometimes talent isn't immediately apparent." "Not apparent?" Chen repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Mr. Santos has demonstrated knowledge that would surpass many of my own senior consultants." Matteo interjected gently. "Mr. Chen, I believe the important thing now is to focus on future opportunities, not past misunderstandings." The class with which Matteo was handling the situation made the contrast with David's incompetence even more striking. Chen nodded, but his expression made it clear that he had lost considerable respect for David and his management. "Mr. Santos, I would like to make a proposal. How about we consider your direct participation in this investment project?" "What do you mean?" David asked, alarm evident in his voice. "Simple," Chen replied. "Any investment we make in this hotel will include the requirement that Mr. Santos be promoted immediately to a position commensurate with his qualifications." David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Not only had he nearly lost the investment through incompetence, but now he was being practically forced to promote someone he had systematically humiliated. That would be great." David forced a smile that was less convincing than a counterfeit bill. Chen continued. "And to ensure that this kind of waste of talent doesn't happen again, I would like Mr. Santos to oversee all international communications related to our investment." Matteo maintained a professional expression, but inside he felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't petty revenge. It was pure and simple justice, served with the elegance of someone who had always known his own worth. "Mr. Chen," Matteo said, "it would be an honor to contribute to this partnership. I have some ideas about how we can create synergies between Chinese cultural expectations and the Brazilian experience of hospitality." "Excellent," Chen smiled genuinely for the first time since arriving at the hotel. Finally, a productive business conversation. David watched helplessly as Matteo presented innovative proposals for cultural integration, employee training programs, and even suggestions for architectural adaptations that would specifically appeal to Asian tourists. Each one was more impressive than the last, and each one further exposed the mediocrity of the management David had offered for years. "One last question, Mr. Santos," Chen said as the meeting drew to a close. "If you could change one thing about this hotel to make it more attractive to international investors, what would it be?" Matteo smiled discreetly before replying, "I would implement a real talent management system. It's amazing how many valuable resources can be hidden right under our noses, just waiting for the right opportunity to shine." The answer was given while looking directly at David, who understood the subliminal message perfectly. Chen laughed, clearly appreciating the elegance of the response. "Remarkable wisdom. I believe we will have a very productive partnership." As the meeting ended with handshakes and plans for future contracts, David watched his own irrelevance crystallize. The investment was secured, but not because of his competence. It was secured despite his incompetence. Even worse, he would now have to live with a daily reminder of how his arrogance and prejudice had almost cost the hotel the biggest deal in its history. Matteo, meanwhile, calmly organized his materials, knowing that he had just rewritten not only his own professional trajectory, but also set a precedent that would echo throughout the hotel. His 4 years of patience had finally found its moment, and the result was more satisfying than any impulsive revenge could have been. Chen said goodbye with a personal business card for Matteo and a promise that the promotion would be officially discussed within the next 48 hours. When the conference room door closed behind Chen's group, David and Matteo were alone for the first time in 4 years, where the positions of power had been completely reversed. The silence between them carried the weight of 4 years of missed opportunities, wasted talent, and a lesson in humility that David would never forget. Matteo stood up to leave, but paused at the door. "David," he said softly, "I hope we can work together in a more collaborative way going forward." There was no triumphalism in his voice, just the quiet dignity of someone who had proven his worth in the most indisputable way possible. David nodded silently, finally understanding that for 4 years he had held a diamond in his hands, but had been too busy being prejudiced to notice its brilliance. As Matteo walked down the hallway toward the elevators, employees who had always ignored him now greeted him with newfound respect. News of the meeting was already spreading throughout the hotel, and everyone wanted to be on the right side of history. When the new order was finally established in the center of that hall, where discrimination disguised as hierarchy had once reigned, a new reality was taking shape, like a symphony that finally finds its harmony after years of discordant notes, proving that true competence knows no color, social class, or limitations imposed by those who confuse privilege with superiority, and that sometimes the sweetest justice is simply allowing genuine talent to finally find its rightful stage. The lesson? True competence is a force that cannot be suppressed indefinitely. This story is a powerful reminder that prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's also a major professional liability that blinds you to the most valuable assets right in front of you. By valuing and seeing people for their skills, not your biases, you not only do the right thing, you also open doors to opportunities you never thought possible.